your radio, on the LBC app, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 6 o'clock. It's been confirmed 20 prisons will pilot the use of medication to suppress sex offenders. It's been recommended as a way of tackling overcrowding in jails in England and Wales. Initially, it will be voluntary, but the government has not ruled out making it compulsory. And LBC's political correspondent, Aggie Chambray, thinks that is the aim of Justice Secretary Shabana Mahmood.
She's very interested in it, thinks it could happen. I mean, who knows whether there would be potential lawsuits down the road trying to make it mandatory, but, you know, she has been clear this is something she wants to investigate, and I think it very much could happen.
Doctors and teachers in England will receive a 4% pay rise this year. The above inflation increases have been confirmed following the latest public sector salary reviews. Most other NHS staff will see their pay go up by 3.6%, higher than the government is believed to have budgeted for. Some of the money will come from existing budgets. The Prime Minister has signed a deal which hands sovereignty of the Chagos Islands over to Mauritius, but includes leasing back the Diego Garcia military base. Sir Keir Starmer claims failing to act now could have allowed other countries to set up military positions there. A man has been arrested after a train travelling from Manchester to Cardiff hit a tractor on a level crossing in Herefordshire. One passenger has been taken to hospital. In the city, the FTSE 100 closed down 47 points at 87.39. The pound buys $1.34 and €1.19. The LBC weather, most places dry tonight with clear spells, mist in the south by dawn, becoming chilly in places with a low of 2 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Tim Humphrey.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. It's 6 p.m. Now, Tonight with Andrew Marr.
Good evening. This is Crime and Punishment Thursday. We know why the government needs to let more people out of prison. There is no space left. And we're told that thanks to electronic tagging and new technologies, punishment in the community is safer than ever. We withhold our judgment, but while we're doing that, we are mulling over what punishment means, and protection, because they are not the same thing. Take chemical castration, one of the new ideas on the table today. As a punishment, I can see arguments against that. Interference with a person's body and imagination against their will, not very far from a definition of torture. But as protection from all the huge numbers of women assaulted violently or killed by men, and children ditto, then frankly, this is a great idea. Deep waters reflected in calls coming into LBC all day.
I'm a victim of a paedophile, in fact, too. My first gut reaction is definitely I have no problem with it. But then sort of almost immediately it's like, but is that the only measure that's been put in place? I'm just wondering whether that wouldn't open up the room for that person to commit more violent crimes because they aren't able to do what they want to do.
I don't think it's barbaric. I think it's appropriate. However, this would be assuming that the paedophile is coming from a place of sexual urges, so it's hormone-driven, which would work for those people. But what about all of the people that are not doing it for sexual pleasures, but are doing it to prey on those that are vulnerable?
If there is one category of offenders who deserve and should be forever persona non gratis and removed from society, it is sex offenders of all types.
There are truly bad people from whom we need to be protected. Only the most dangerous, the most wicked, will stay in prison all of their lives and die there. Currently, that is a tiny proportion, around 70 people out of the 88,000 in prison just now. In their case, we have substituted the death penalty for, as it were, the living death penalty. And I find I have no real problem with that. It's a protection question, not a punishment one. But today we're really talking about the vast majority who have been lured into crime by peer group pressure or bravado or greed or a rotten upbringing, or in some cases just being too lazy to get up in the morning and schlep off to do some useful work. How do we feel about them? If you are yourself the victim of a crime, burglars violating your house, your life savings thieved online, even having your phone stolen by a kid on a bike, then a hot rush of anger tends to take over, and you would like to do unspeakable things back at them. But later on, a more rational mood descends, and then we think, once they're in prison, they'll come out again, so how do we want them to come out then? We want them to be working, not idle, paying their bills, in control of their lives rather than under the control of alcohol or drugs. In short, we want them rehabilitated. These new measures should mean people leaving prison earlier, but in a better frame of mind, prepared to earn their freedom. Overall, the right thing. I say that knowing perfectly well there will be terrible occasional consequences. Already today, some bad people are let out of prison and go on to do further bad things. But now we know, don't we, that if this person, who would not have been released so early before, commits that crime, then this minister will be blamed for it. I say this minister, and she's sitting right beside me now. She is, of course, the Secretary of State for Justice and Lord Chancellor, Shabana Mahmood. Shabana, welcome. You are letting out, you propose to let out a lot of people much earlier. The public listening will think, therefore, inevitably, I am going to be less safe. Why are they wrong?
Well, the first thing I would say is that, ever since I came into office, I've been confronted with a prison system on the point of collapse. That is the legacy of the last Conservative government. I've been looking at the prison numbers going right down to zero, ever since I took up my post. And the one thing that I will never allow to happen is that we run out of prison places in this country. That is the thing that makes everybody collectively less safe, because at that point, I would have to say to the police, you can no longer make any arrests. I would have to say to the courts, you can't hear any more trials because we have no prison places left. I consider that to be the breakdown of law and order in this country, and I will not risk that, and no responsible government would ever let that happen. So I've got to avoid that at all costs in order to keep us all safe and in order to make sure that we always have prison places available for people that need to be locked up.
But the people who have been locked up already are more or less by definition now pretty bad people. They've done pretty bad things anyway, often repeatedly, and that's why they're in prison. So when they come out, you need a really, really efficient system of observing them, checking them, monitoring them. Do we have that?
Well, look, I've secured a huge uplift in probation funding from the Chancellor of the Exchequer as part of the spending review negotiations. We will have up to £700 million more for probation in the final year of the spending review. That builds on our current budget of £1.6 billion. So this is a big increase in probation funding. I will use that money to invest in hiring more staff so that we have more probation officers. I will invest in technology. We'll buy tens of thousands more tags, which we know work. And so that I can ensure that in this new model of a 3-stage sentence, once somebody has done their period in custody and they're under intense supervision in the community, that we are able to rise to that challenge. And that is what the new funding for probation will enable us to deliver.
Can I make a radical suggestion? Why can't we just have absolute honesty in sentencing? If I am sent to prison at the moment for 5 years or 10 years say, then everybody knows I'll be out in 5 years. Under this proposal, it may be 2 or 3 years. Why can't we just actually be honest in court and say this person is going to prison for this amount of time period, and stop kind of halving or thirding the sentences?
Well, look, this is part of what David Gork and his review have also recommended, that moving to this earned progression model for standard determinate sentences, which is the bulk of sentences that we see in this country, would enable greater transparency, because victims will know that this will be in 3 stages. But somebody who plays by the rules in prison and behaves properly can earn their way to an earlier release, the minimum point at which will be 1/3 of the sentence. But if they break the rules, if they behave badly, they'll serve longer. And so you will still have a range between that minimum of around 1/3 up to possibly 50%. But at least victims and everybody else will know that the sentence always takes place in 3 stages, one of which is custody, the second of which is enhanced supervision, intensive supervision, and then the final stage where we still have conditions that we can place upon offenders, and also recall available to us if they offend again.
Let me put you, as it were, party politics aside, if you don't mind, 2 Tory suggestions about how to deal with this. The first is that you should disapply the Human Rights Act and send foreign criminals imprisoned here back home to free up some space and therefore not have to release so many criminals onto the streets of Britain.
Well, the first thing I would say is we are already deporting foreign national offenders at a higher rate than the previous Conservative government. So thanks for the suggestion from Tories, but our track record on foreign national offenders since we've been in government is strong, and we are. But
you could disapply the Human Rights Act and deport many more.
Well, the review actually makes 2 recommendations, both of which we have accepted, and both of which will enable the quicker deportation of more foreign national offenders. The first of which is the change in the early removal scheme for how much time they need to have served in prison before they become eligible for deportation. We've accepted that recommendation. And the other thing that David Gauke says is that for people who are sentenced to less than 3 years for an offence, you should move as immediately as you can to deportation after the sentencing takes place. And we've said that we'll work up proposals to enable that to happen with the Home Office. So I think the issue here is not the Human Rights Act or the European Convention. It's actually the speed at which you can do deportations, and we will keep making progress.
Second suggestion, why not rent some space in jails in the 14 European countries which do have spare space?
Well, look, again, I inherited proposals from the previous government who'd been talking for quite a long time without doing a deal to the Estonians, as it happened in that case. The reality is that you still wouldn't be able to get the level of places that we need to meet the demand coming in. So you'd still have a huge shortfall. The price tag for that is particularly high, and could not be done in the time that we need in order to meet our own capacity gaps here. So it just didn't work. It's why the previous government didn't do a deal, and it's why when I kicked the tires on it, I realised that's not an option for us either.
Let me ask you about the big headline grabber in all of this. Do you have any moral qualms at all about forcibly chemically castrating somebody?
No, I am exploring mandation as part of our proposals to expand the use of chemical suppressants alongside psychological interventions for sex offenders. What I've inherited is actually a very, very small pilot, and I want to go nationwide. We'll start with an expansion into 2 new regions, and as I say, at the moment it starts off voluntary, and we will keep that up to begin with. I will test the evidence, but do I morally object to the idea? No, I do not.
Well, the reason I ask that is that it not only changes somebody's physical condition, but also possibly their mental condition. It is quite an invasive thing to do to somebody. And if you look at the range of possible side effects of the drugs being used, they include much more serious cardiovascular health problems, bone density problems, mental health problems, metabolic issues, anemia, fatigue, all sorts of things. Now, if somebody is wrongfully convicted of a sex offence and then forcibly castrated, you are really damaging their health and their life prospects.
Well, look, you would never do this in cases where there's any doubt. I mean, at the moment, it started off as a voluntary trial, a very, very small-scale pilot in this country. I think that the evidence, small though it is, from other jurisdictions and from here, suggests that the combination of chemical suppressants, 2 types of medication, plus psychological interventions can have a huge impact on reducing reoffending. We will start building on that pilot. We will do a phased rollout, starting with 2 new regions. It will remain voluntary for now, but what I've said is I'm willing to look at mandation as well. And the reason for that is this is deeply problematic behaviour, and if it can be shown to work to reduce reoffending, I think that we should use every tool at our disposal. It can put
children and women at less risk. I do absolutely understand that. But nonetheless, when you say mandatory and I say forcible, what are we actually talking about here? Are we talking about pills that people will be forced to swallow? Do we send them a packet of pills and send them home and assume they will keep taking them? Do we tie them to bread and give them an injection? How does it actually work?
Look, I'm not going to design that system now.
But it kind of matters, doesn't it?
It does, but I think what I've been very clear about is where we start. And the start point is building on the current pilot that we have. We will expand it. I want to go nationwide with it. We have to build the evidence base in this country. I want to test for ourselves, not just based on international evidence, what really happens with reoffending longer term as well. well. And then, of course, in a future world, you could consider incentivization, steps short of mandation potentially, or full mandation. That could take many different forms. I don't want to decide those today, but what I've said is I will build on the pilot we have and I will explore all options at our disposal.
This sounds to me slightly like a sort of sometime never idea for the future rather than a clear policy for the here and now.
No, I would disagree with that, because I've taken something that is that's sort of been marked in the box, let's just ignore this and look away. And I've said, actually, other countries are moving in this direction. They're doing so, with positive effects. There are lessons to learn here. I'm not squeamish about using chemical suppressants and psychological interventions to deal with sex offenders. And I'm willing to therefore go nationwide on the pilot that we have already, expand that into 2 regions, bring in up to 20 other prisons into the scope of this work, and then see where the evidence takes.
Lord Chancellor, thank you very much indeed for coming in and talking to LBC.
Thank you.
And that was the Lord Chancellor and Secretary of State for Justice, Shabana Mahmood. Let's hear now from Nicole Jacobs, the Domestic Abuse Commissioner for England and Wales. We spoke to her earlier this week, and this time last week, I should say, and she expressed her concerns that victims could be put in danger because of these measures and that their lives might even be at risk. Now the report has been released. Have her fears been confirmed? She's with me now, Nicole. So, in short, have they?
No, I mean, it's the whole sweeping nature of these reforms and the idea of how quickly they may come into play. Recall, for example, we know will come into play very early. So someone who's breached their condition, they've been let out early, they've breached their conditions, and then being recalled for only 28 days. A lot of this investment about probation, the kind of support that's being discussed, that's coming much later. So the timescales don't add up for me.
So to be clear, you're not really reassured?
I'm not reassured that baked in from the very start of when these changes happen, that we have genuinely safeguarded victims from the start. I'm reassured by some of the mitigations, but if you think about the extent to which we're now accepting shorter sentences, the idea that for short sentences, they may be served in the community. I mean, for victims of domestic abuse, as we've talked about before, these are offenders who know everything about their victims, and this is the kind of thing we can't just implement without the regard for victim safety.
All happening too fast. Let's focus, particularly for obvious reasons, on victims of domestic abuse. Presumably, if they went ahead with the chemical castration problems, that would remove some of those offenders from a dangerous position. But there are others who are frankly just thugs, just like to exercise power and violence and beat up people, beat up women. They would not be affected.
For people who offend in terms of domestic abuse, we would like to think that there's all sorts of reasons that if they wouldn't drink or use drugs, that somehow that may help curtail some of their behavior. But it's the same principle. Someone who is perpetrating sexual violence, if they're a domestic abuse offender, that will be one of many, many behaviors. So a use of a drug that might inhibit that behavior certainly won't touch the sides of the kind of coercive, controlling behavior, physical violence, that drive to control their partner. And that's what I think within all of these reforms, we have to keep sight of how that crime in particular is quite different than a stranger, someone who's been a victim of crime, very sadly, but by someone who doesn't know them. Domestic abuse is so uniquely different, and we have to really have the thickest thread throughout all these reforms. These are quite sweeping reforms, and I'm afraid I think they send a message to victims that they're not going to receive the justice they deserve in the same way they might have expected. You talked about radical honesty earlier. I think that's a great phrase. We need to be radically honest about what we really are doing to safeguard victims in all of this.
A very important warning there, Nicole Jacobs. I hope ministers are listening. Thank you very much for coming in. Now, I'd like to hear your thoughts on the measures you have heard so far today, especially that controversial proposal of mandatory chemical castration for paedophiles and other sex offenders. Would you support that? Text me on 84850 or email marr@lbc.co.uk. UK. In a few moments, we're going to talk about the tragic killing of a young Jewish couple in Washington, D.C., and the importance of tackling the anti-Semitism that's been rising right around the world since the outbreak of the war in Gaza. You are listening to Tonight with Andrew Marr, and the time is now 6:20.
This is LBC.
At risk.
Tonight with Andrew Marr. Watch live on both Global Player and the new LBC app.
It's 6:22. I asked for texts and app messages, and in they come, including from people who know what they're speaking about. This one is from Heather, who says, I was previously policy lead for anti-libidinal drugs for sex offenders, chemical castration at the Ministry of Justice. Well done, Heather. It's only suitable, she says, for certain types of offender, and it's currently used on a voluntary basis only when there is a clinical or medical need. It is not a panacea, but used as a part of a wider package of risk management interventions. Used on its own and without other interventions, it's unlikely to reduce sexual offending. To use it on a mandatory basis would mean making it a licensed condition. Refusal to comply would likely result in recall. Currently, an approved psychiatrist is used to prescribe the medication. Really interesting, Heather. Thank you very much indeed for that. Now, with more criminals set to serve their sentence in the community instead of behind bars, attention, of course, turns to the probation service, which will be responsible for managing those offenders and helping to rehabilitate them. But crucially, probation officers are also the people who will assess the risk these criminals pose to the public. And LBC has seen exclusive figures which show one offender on probation is being charged with murder every 6 days. With concerns raised about how stretched the probation service is now before the reforms are even implemented, and LBC's reporter Fraser Knight is with me to explain more. Fraser, take it away.
Well, Andrew, these are really concerning figures. Of course, when people are out in the community, they're on probation, they're on licence or serving community orders, you have probation officers who have to try and manage that risk. But what we have seen is that on average, one offender who is under the supervision of probation is being charged with murder every 6 days. Between January 2020 and April 2024, we found 244 offenders who were charged with murder after they had been released from prison. It's a really concerning statistic.
This is devastating because, we're talking about releasing many more people, and this is before any of these reforms. Huge numbers of murderers out on probation, and the probation service unable to keep an eye on them, unable to stop them killing other people.
Yeah, the probation service already really stretched as well. I speak to some of the unions and they say our caseload has gone through the roof even after the early release scheme. Now, we've been speaking to the mum of one teenager who was killed in South Wales 10 years ago, 18 years old, Connor Marshall, and his mum Nadine, saying that she's worried that these reforms that are being put forward today, more people serving their sentences in the community, could lead to further crimes.
That's my biggest fear, that any other single family has to endure the nightmare that we continue to live. It's just another accident waiting to happen. With an increase in offenders being released or put to community orders and supervisions, it's just a ticking time bomb. It absolutely is, and it scares the living daylights out of me.
And when it comes to unions of these probation officers as well, they say it's something that really, really concerns those officers, not knowing when the next crime is going to be committed because they have so many people to watch after. Ben Coburn is the national chair of the NAPO Probation Union.
I think it's something that probation staff live with day to day and deal with day to day, but not just in the working time. I think it's something that you deal with when you're not in work as well. So when you're on leave or in the night time when you're not in work, there's this constant fear of what is happening with the people who I'm working with, who maybe I can't dedicate the time that I want to dedicate to do my job to the best of the ability.
Now, of course, we heard from Shabana Mahmood, the Justice Secretary, saying that there is going to be up to £700 million put into the probation service to try and help them through that. But speaking to the unions, they say while it is a positive direction of travel, they say there's already a crisis around staffing. They need to shore up the workforce. And a big part of that, they say, is that they need a big pay increase, which is going to be a difficult one to get when they say they need several thousand more staff as it is just now.
How often it comes back to pay. Fraser Knight, thank you very much indeed for coming in. Now, yesterday, two young members of the Israeli embassy in Washington, Yaron Lischinski and Sarah Milgrim, who were about to get engaged, were shot dead outside the Jewish Museum. A 30-year-old man from Chicago, Elias Rodriguez, was taken into custody for the shooting and shouted, "Free Palestine," as he was arrested. This is a horrible killing which has spread fear among Jews far beyond Israel. Has the war in Gaza made Jewish diasporas around the world less safe? Oren Segal is the Senior Vice President of the Counter-Extremism and Intelligence part of the Anti-Defamation League. Oren, thank you very much indeed for joining me. This is a terrible event in Washington. We've seen lots and lots of coverage of anti-Semitic incidents in universities and elsewhere across the US because of Gaza. Do you think this is a tipping point into a much more dangerous phase for prominent Jewish people in America?
Yeah, I think this is the logical result of a persistent level of demonization of Jews in Israel at protests and online. When you combine that with the glorification of terrorism and terrorist violence, this is an environment that has been created over a period of time that I think has enabled what we saw yesterday to occur.
There's obviously a big education challenge here to get people to understand that Jewish doesn't mean Israeli, and Israeli doesn't mean a supporter of the Netanyahu government. That seems to be something that's lacking. Can your league do much about that? Is there a sort of outreach education thing to be done?
We're certainly trying, but you got it right. Criticism of Israeli policies is not something that we consider anti-Semitic. We don't count that in our data, and it's not something that, reasonable people need to fight against. But when people are conflating criticism of Israel and ascribing that to all Jews, as we have seen time and again in this country, we know it animates people to violence. And so I think what's really important is for us to continue to speak out and hopefully make people understand that, when you use the type of language that legitimizes violence and terrorists, and you conflate the Jewish community with Israel and Israeli policies, the end result is what we saw in DC. And by the way, last year in 2024, we documented a 20% increase in assaults against the Jewish community throughout the United States. Out of 9,000 incidents that we tracked, there is a surge of anti-Semitism, and hopefully people will start taking it seriously before there's more blood on the ground.
And this may be too general a question, but have there been changes in the behaviour of Jewish communities across the United States in terms of wearing, obviously Jewish clothing and kippahs and the rest of it? Are people starting to change their behaviour because they're frightened of attack?
I think we've seen a lot more of that in Europe, but there are some folks that report to us that they're not comfortably being visibly Jewish anymore by wearing garments or having mezuzahs on their doors. I think what we need to understand is that there's also security procedures. The Jewish community, in many ways, is the most secure in terms of their institutions, and yet how far does the perimeter need to be increased in order for that security to last? I think that's something that the community is struggling with in the wake of this attack.
And I assume because they are connected with the Israeli state and therefore the Israeli government, diplomats and other Jewish people here as part of the embassy are particularly vulnerable or particularly likely to be targets.
It's possible. It's not clear to me that this person knew who he was targeting when he was, going from Chicago to DC. What seems clear, based on a manifesto that this individual left, based on the people that he was associating with, is that he was there to target the Jewish community. Unfortunately, they don't ask the questions, and we have innocent people getting killed no matter what, whether they're Israelis or Jews. He was there to do damage, it appears, and unfortunately, he was successful.
Oren, thank you very much indeed for talking to LBC tonight on this very sad day. Thank you. Thank you indeed. Now, coming up, the UK has signed the deal with Mauritius to give away sovereignty of the Chagos Islands after a last-minute to and fro in the courts. I'm going to be speaking to two Chagosians who took the government to court in an effort to thwart the deal. But first, time now 6:31, and Tim Humphrey has your news headlines.
The Justice Secretary has told LBC she has no moral objections to making chemical castration for sex offenders compulsory. Shabana Mahmood has expanded voluntary pilot schemes to 20 prisons. The UK is to pay Mauritius £101 million a year to operate a military base on the Chagos Islands. The Prime Minister said he had to do a deal after giving up British sovereignty of the territory, arguing other countries could have set up positions there otherwise. Doctors and teachers in England and Wales are getting a pay rise. It's a 4% increase based on independent recommendations. Other NHS workers will get 3.6%. LBC weather, most places dry tonight with clear spells, mist in the south by dawn and a low of 2 degrees.
This is LBC. Tonight with Andrew Marr. Listen on your smart speaker. Just say, play LBC.
6:33. I didn't think that this proposal for mandatory chemical castration would produce a kind of warm bath of unanimity, and judging by your text, it hasn't. This one comes from Ed in Cheltenham. How can we even consider, he says, mandatory castration? Isn't it a slippery slope? It sets an awful precedent for medical intervention in crime and punishment. Keep it voluntary. But Beatrix sent us this via WhatsApp. Yes, I would support mandatory chemical castration. My granddaughter was sexually assaulted at the age of 10. The offender has now been sent to jail again as he re-offended. Do keep these texts coming in, please. 84850, don't forget, or email mar@lbc.co.uk. Now, it is clearly going ahead. Britain is to hand over the Chagos Islands to Mauritius, despite a last-minute court case during which an injunction against the Foreign Office was granted over the rights of exiled Chagosian people. The largest island in the Pacific archipelago, Diego Garcia, will remain under British control for 99 years. It houses a huge British and American military base. But the rest of the island chain goes to Mauritius, and it will allow the Chagosians the right of return after they were expelled by Britain in the 1960s and 70s. Not everybody is happy with this deal, least of all Bertrice Pompe and Bernadette Dugasse, who both took the government to the High Court today in an attempt to thwart it. They spoke to me a little earlier to explain exactly why. Bertrice began by explaining the essence of her case.
Our rights, my rights, have been undermined because the British government has not consulted me or any of the Chagosians regarding the deal they're making with Mauritius. And I am a native from Diego Garcia, and with the deal, I will not be allowed on Diego Garcia.
So you're excluded from your place of birth. And Bernadette, I think both of you were actually born on Diego Garcia and came to Britain as very young children. Do you have a strong sense that this is your homeland and you want to go back there?
Well, we've not come to Britain as young children. We were deported, uprooted, deported, and dumped in the Seychelles without our consent. And we live in Britain because we wanted to have to be close to put the British government to court so we can have our rights back to us.
And in an ideal world where you are winning court cases, what would your future look like for both of you? Bertrice first.
In an ideal world, we will be given our human rights. We will be allowed to go to our place of birth without any sanctions, without any law against us, like anyone else, like especially like a British citizen.
And
to me,
yes, Bernadette.
To me, if we were given our rights back, we will be like everybody else. We can go back home freely, enjoy our island, enjoy everything like the British, the Americans, the Filipinos, the Mauritians are enjoying themselves. And we are being excluded and stay out of our island. I don't know for how long.
It's been an emotional roller coaster of the day for you both because you won a case very early on and then it was overturned. Can I ask finally a message for Keir Starmer from both of you? Bertrice first, then Bernadette.
We're not giving up. We're coming for him.
I will say, Keir Starmer, hold on tight on your horse. Bernadette Dugasse is coming back for you. Karma is a bitch.
All right. Thank you both very much indeed for spending some time with LBC on this extraordinary day. Well, there you go. And how is this deal being received on the Labour backbenches? Peter Lamb is the Labour MP for Crawley, the seat where thousands of Chagosians moved in the 1960s. Peter, thank you for coming in. I think you believe that Keir Starmer and the government generally have been hiding behind the courts rather than taking a lead.
I think there's a moral case to answer here. You know, it's not just about what the current situation is in international law, where it is fair to say there is a mixture of opinions as to what is actually the legal requirements in place in the UK. The fundamental principle of self-determination should exist for all peoples. These peoples were removed from those islands in the 60s and 70s under Labour and Conservative governments. That was utterly without consultation with them. They were deposited in Mauritius initially. They did eventually get the opportunity to move to the UK more recently. But for that period of time, they've been shifted around from one place to another, never having any say in the future of their country. And yet again, we're choosing not to engage them. That's their country, it's their choice.
So this was a colonial act back then. Now, it's sometimes said, as in a sort of dismissive way, the Chagosians have many different views about what should happen next. And the implication is, therefore, they shouldn't really be listened to.
Well, the British public has many different views. Whenever we have a referendum, it usually comes down to a couple of percentage points. So the question is whether or not we'd ignore the British public's right to be consulted on issues at the general election if we really thought that a mixture of opinions was that big a problem. The reality around this is, yes, there are different sides to this argument within the community, but they've not been systematically consulted. It's not been in the British interest to systematically consult them about these issues. And unfortunately, when you look into the detail, many of the things that the people are in favour of think are going to come out of this. It is not apparent in the deal that they're there.
And to be clear, forgive my geographical vagueness about this, but as I understand it, the right of the return is to Mauritius for a lot of people, and the actual amount of space to live on in the remaining islands on the Chagos chain outside Diego Garcia is very limited.
Well, Diego Garcia is by far the largest island in the archipelago. That is where the majority of the people have come from. Under this deal, they will not be allowed to inhabit that. They will be allowed to inhabit other islands there and to do visits, potentially, to that island. But beyond that, there is a fundamental problem with British Chagosians trying to exercise the right to return there, which is Mauritian Criminal Code Amendment Act 2021 means that if you have ever in any way indicated that you do not believe that Mauritius has entitlement to any territory that they believe they have entitlement to, you can suffer a 10-year imprisonment sentence. The act of claiming British citizenship is arguably a violation of that act. So any of my constituents who try to return home may well face a 10-year prison sentence.
That is a horrible situation. I mean, as I understand, legally and diplomatically, the stable door is open, the horse has bolted. What can you do now, if anything?
Well, it has to go through Parliament still. There is a treaty that has been signed, but you cannot give up the territory without it going through Parliament. The Act, I understand, will essentially say we will adopt the provisions of the treaty, and it will be for members of Parliament to vote at that particular point in time, and I will be doing my best to oppose that. So do you think there are enough Labour MPs that you can persuade on this to actually stop it happening? I think that's unlikely, if I'm honest. The reality, unfortunately, for Chagosians is it's too small a population concentrated in too small a number of places to have that level of sway. But I would just say to any MPs, Labour MPs who are listening, you know, we did this to them in the 60s. We committed a horrendous abuse of human rights. What we are doing now will make that permanent. And if we think we're any less guilty by doing that now compared to what was done at the time, I struggle to see how that actually works in logic. You make a very, very powerful moral point, Peter. Thank you very much indeed for coming in. Now then, finally, what are the defence and security implications of the deal? Something that has been absolutely central to the negotiations, but not very much talked about. Let's hear the thoughts of Professor Michael Clarke, Defence and Foreign Affairs Analyst and a former Director General of RUSI. Thank you very much indeed, Professor, for joining me. I gather that crucial to this deal is a really big exclusion zone that's been agreed around the islands, and that prior to it, there was genuine worry that, in particular, Chinese boats and submarines and so forth could come very close to the military base, and that is the reason that President Trump has agreed and signed off on this. What are your thoughts?
Yes, there's an exclusion zone of 24 nautical miles, which is 26 miles, statute miles. Well, that's a complete exclusion zone around the base, which is big enough to allow the base to operate all its electronic equipment and its satellite tracking and the seismic stuff that it does for the global community without interference. But there's also a part of the deal, at least on paper, is that there can be no development within any of the Chagos Islands. So that means about 100 nautical miles, about 110 statute miles around the base. Nothing can happen to the other islands without Britain agreeing. So Mauritius and Britain have, between them, they have to agree. So that means if Mauritius were to say, oh, well, we don't mind having a Chinese base or something on one of the outer islands, it couldn't happen legally unless Britain agreed. So it's a complete exclusion zone for, let's say, 26 miles, and it's a veto power over anything that happens for 110 miles. So that's the nature of the protection that it's giving to the base. And they're paying $100 million a year for it. And that's why a lot of people say, oh, it was a $9.9 billion deal. Well, it is over 99 years. If you pay $100 million a year and over 90, by the year 21-24, we'll have paid 9.9 billion. But remember that the French are paying 85 million euros a year for Djibouti, which is a tiny base compared to Diego Garcia. So it's in the market of base rentals, 100 million a year is not too bad. It's pretty good.
All right. A question from, as it were, the daft laddie listening who says, well, hold on a second, it's an awful long way away from us. Why are we paying any money to have a base so far away? What's it really doing to defend our interests around the world? Not the Americans, ours.
Yeah, well, we use it quite a lot. There's an air base there, which is very important, and we're in and out of. There's a port. We've got a lot of listening stuff there. A lot of intelligence operations go from there, and we use it for transit as well. So yes, the Americans value it more than we do because they operate just more stuff than we do. But nevertheless, when we need it, it's very useful indeed because we've got bases in the Middle East. We've got Duqm in Oman, which is a base that's being built up. We've got the naval base in Bahrain, and we've got a big air component in Doha at Al Udeid. But if you want to take one more step eastwards, then you've got to really go to Diego Garcia, and then you're halfway to Singapore and East Asia, if that matters to you strategically.
Well, final question is indeed on the strategy, because this is presumably at the epicenter, on the front line of this gigantic confrontation, really, between China and the West.
Correct. And one of the countries that most welcomes this deal, we talk about the Americans, they welcome it, because if we didn't do this deal, it would be in a sort of legal limbo, and then the Chinese really would be sailing boats next to Diego Garcia, and we couldn't do anything about it legally. This provides a legal framework. Who will enforce it? We're probably not capable of enforcing it ourselves, but the Americans will enforce it, and so will India. India is really keen on this deal for exactly the same reasons that we are, that it provides a legal framework that will keep China out of the area that most matters to us for a sensitive base. So with the United States and India behind this deal, then there's a reasonable chance, at least from a security perspective, that it will stick.
Michael Clarke, I understand far more about the rationale behind this deal than I did 5 minutes ago. Thank you so much. Now then, I'm going to be joined by my political panel in just a few minutes to reflect on a week that has had seen some huge milestones for the government. At the time now, 6:45.
Coming up at 7 on LBC, Ian Dale.
The Justice Secretary has announced sentencing reforms which will see some serious offenders released after serving only a third of their sentences. Have victims been forgotten?
Ian Dale on LBC. This is LBC. Message Andrew Marr on WhatsApp now on 0345 6060 973.
Well, for better or worse, chemical castration is the theme of the evening. I was asking for WhatsApp and they carry on coming in. Tim says, castration suggests an irreversible procedure, but chemical castration does not cause a permanent loss of sexual desire. It is a drug-managed reduction in that desire rather than surgical. So come off the drugs and the offender would return to where they were before the treatment. A very good point from Tim there. But Miles has this story about his father. 2 words, Andrew, says Miles. Alan Turing. I'm really glad somebody has mentioned those 2 words, Miles, because Alan Turing was, of course, the great genius of the early computer age. He was also gay, and he was given chemical castration, and I think then killed himself in later life. Miles goes on, please, my father had prostate cancer and took these drugs to reduce testosterone. He found the impact of them to be worse than death. This is illiberal and objectionable. What next? Cutting the hands off thieves? Now, this has been one of the most consequential weeks for the government since the election. A UK-EU deal on Monday, a massive change in government language and the scrapping of trade negotiations with Israel on Tuesday, a long-awaited winter fuel payment U-turn on Wednesday, and the release of that sentencing review today. So, to say the least, a very busy week. Here to look back on it all is my political panel. Lucy White, political correspondent from Bloomberg, and Alison Phillips, my columnist colleague at the New Statesman and former editor of the Daily Mirror. Welcome to you both. Now, I'd like to start off by talking actually about Israel and that big shift in government tone and opinion, what you both think about that. But before I do, let me just read what Benjamin Netanyahu has said just a few moments ago in a response to to their initiative. He says, "I say to President Macron, Prime Minister Carney, and Prime Minister Starmer, when mass murderers, rapists, baby killers and kidnappers thank you, you are on the wrong side of justice, you're on the wrong side of humanity, and you're on the wrong side of history. Now, these leaders may think they're advancing peace. They are not. They're emboldening Hamas to continue fighting forever." So, very, very strong there. Alison, do you think that will have any effect at all on how the Prime Minister sees this?
I don't. I mean, obviously, the killings of the two diplomats was absolutely horrendous, and obviously we are still seeing anti-Semitism around the world. But I think it had reached the point where the government felt that they had to speak publicly, and I thought it was a very interesting sort of alliance with Canada and France to come out at that point. Obviously, now in this world where America is not part of that conversation, and that there was a real sense that the things that people have been seeing that have been happening in Gaza no longer could remain silent.
Lucy, as the strength of that response from Netanyahu makes clear, this was a remarkable change of tone from the British government, wasn't it?
It's interesting to see that the British government has been trying to toe a particularly difficult line at the moment. I mean, in briefings with journalists every day this week, we've heard the Prime Minister's spokesman, be very clear that, we are still a friend and an ally of Israel, but at the same time, ending trade talks, coming up with that statement. It's a really difficult balance.
Sanctioning individuals.
Exactly, yeah.
It's a big moment. Let's move to the beginning of the week again, and that big EU-UK deal. Alison, your old paper, the Daily Mirror, was warmly welcoming on the front page, as we would expect. But papers on the other side of the political aisle, as it were crying surrender, treason, betrayal, the language of war. What do you think the final outcome is? How is this going to settle down politically for the government?
Well, I think obviously that on the right it was going to be a Brexit betrayal, all of those things. And really, but then there was many on the left that really felt it didn't go particularly far at all. And there was so much that still hangs in the balance that we don't really know what that's going to look like. So I think, if anything, it's very much a first step towards wherever we may end up. And I think that there's a general sense that although there was anger from Kemi Badenoch, and there was anger from Nigel Farage, and there was anger in the right-wing press, in the actual general public, I don't think there was enough tangible things to be angry about. And actually, I think people will accept it. They realise that some kind of closeness and realignment is a good thing. It's a good thing for jobs, and they will go with it.
Lucy, I'd like to pick up on that in terms of the general mood. We see the raw polling numbers and so forth, but there seems to be a sense in the public of absolute exhausted weariness with the whole Brexit subject. Just shut up, a lot of you. We don't want to revisit Brexit. We don't want the Remainers or the Brexiteers shouting at us any longer. And that might be what Keir Starmer is banking on.
I think that's quite right. And I think, for people, voters, they're not really going to care about any of this unless they can see it making a tangible impact on their lives. So, if it means prices in the shops are going to go down, maybe that will, make them a bit happier. If they can see that it's easier to get through gates at airports, then, maybe that will make them happier as well. It's difficult to be able to be particularly positive or negative about this either way at the moment, because it's just another step, as Alison says. It's a step in a future path, and it's nice that we've got it kicked off now. We've got this sort of closer relationship with the EU solidified slightly, but at the same time, the government's still trying to, form closer relationships with the US and the like as well. So I think it's nice that we have some sort of format to proceed with, but from there on,
And some of the anger felt quite performative, didn't it? There wasn't enough to really be angry about.
I was speaking to someone.
I think that's right. Yeah. I was talking to Nick Thomas-Simmons, who negotiated all of this, and he did say, one thing that's going to happen, this is the first UK-EU summit since Brexit, and there's going to be a summit now every year. Once you've got a summit happening every year, people will start to try and put things on the agenda. So I do think it's probably the part of a process, not the end of anything.
It's a first step.
I was speaking to someone earlier this week, about the extension of the fishing rights for 12 years. And they said, if it'd been 6 years, 8 years, 12 years, there was always going to be that performative anger on the right. So
let's talk about U-turns. U-turn if you want to. The lady is not for turning. But there is a sense that actually the public doesn't mind a U-turn if it's on something the public wanted in the first place. However, we're talking, of course, here about the winter fuel tax allowance being removed. First act of Rachel Reeves. Lucy, how much damage has this done, do you think, to the government?
I think it was one of the big issues that was coming up on the doorstep when in the local elections earlier this month. It was one of the things that people were most angry about that the Labour government had done, and it was one of the first things they did. One of the first big moves that they made. So it really stuck in people's heads as this is what this government is about, and it's not something you'd expect from a Labour government either. It's not. And, it's now raised the question of what else is the Labour government willing to U-turn on?
So there are two kinds of damage. There is the residual damage among a public which remain angry about that first move, but also there's the question of the Treasury kind of losing its reputation for steel-clad inflexibility.
Exactly, and I think the big thing that the Labour government has tried to put out to financial markets is that our fiscal rules are absolutely unbreakable. We're definitely kind of sticking to being a responsible government, and now you're seeing a U-turn on that, and now there's talk about is there going to be a U-turn on welfare? Is there going to be a U-turn on the two-child benefit cap? My colleague had a fantastic story a few hours ago about a divide at the top of number 10 around the two-child benefit cap, and now whether that's going to be looked at. So,
Well, there is the voice of the financial markets, if you like, Bloomberg. Now, we do think about this, you see, because I can now turn to the former voice of the Labour supporting working classes, Alison Phillips. So the real question is whether you think the Labour family, as it were, is going to push very hard for further shifts, particularly on personal independence payments or PIPs and on welfare more generally. In other words, a lot of Labour MPs have been furious about the winter fuel allowance, but they go on straight away to say, and we can't have the kind of benefit cuts that are being suggested by the Treasury at the moment. Do you think we're about to see a real fight in the party of a kind we haven't seen for years?
Well, there definitely is that anger, but I mean, as Lucy was saying, there is already some talk that there might be a rolling back of some of the welfare benefit cuts that have been talked about, particularly around the personal independence payments. I mean, my slight concern when the winter fuel rollback was announced was I thought, is this a sop to those people on the left that want a rollback in the hope that they can get those disability benefits sort of through? Whether that will happen now, I'm not so sure, because there's definitely a real sense that although there's been so much focus on fending off reform from the right, actually there is a real risk to this government from the left and from the sense that votes are being lost to the Liberal Democrats and to the Greens if you haven't got a Labour government that looks, sounds and talks like a Labour government. And so I think we probably are seeing a softening here, but of course that does then come back to the problem of where's the money coming from? Which was the reason that we were told at the beginning that none of this was possible.
And one person, Lucy, has an answer to where the money's coming from. I refer, of course, to the Deputy Prime Minister, Angela Rayner.
Say me then.
Not you.
Me, please.
But Angela Rayner had this, it was a paper, I think, back in March, which was leaked to the Daily Telegraph earlier on, with 8 different proposed tax rises. Now, that was just one discussion document. Discussion documents happen all the time, but it does point to something. The thing it points to is that there is a real desire on the Labour backbenches for higher taxes.
Mm-hmm. And we've seen some of that already. We've seen the Labour government trying to be, tougher on non-doms and everything. But then we've seen some of that kind of a little bit watered down. And we have a Labour government at the moment who is keen to be welcoming. One of the proposals that they got elected on was to boost growth in the UK. So they're very worried about doing anything that's going to upset the higher paid workers in the UK. And I think there's a real worry that they might scare people away if they're to do too much on wealth tax or something.
We're almost out of time. So, Alison, an almost one-word answer. Is the Deputy Prime Minister on manoeuvres?
Quite possibly.
Quite possibly. There you go. Angela Rayner, be very, very careful. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, where you can also pause and rewind live radio, as well as listen to a range of podcasts. Download now for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 10 on LBC, Ben Kentish. But right now, it's time for Ian Dale.
Thanks, Andrew. The Justice Secretary has announced sentencing reforms which will see some serious offenders released after serving only a third of their sentences. Have victims been forgotten in the drive to solve prison overcrowding problems? At 8, former MP Theo Clarke joins me to discuss her new book, Breaking the Taboo, Why We Need to Talk About Birth Trauma, and she'll take your calls on the subject. At 9, we'll come back to the legal system reforms. The Justice Secretary considers mandatory chemical castration